The nearly carbon-neutral setting of this conference means that we're joining together in Santa Barbara in mind, but not in body. Inspired by this, I want to begin by asking you to imagine another journey to Santa Barbara, departing from Honolulu in August 1997. On this trip, Charles Moore captained the oceanographic research vessel Alguita through a gyre of plastic debris halfway between Hawaii and California, where, as he puts it, he was confronted as far as the eye could see with the sight of plastic. What became known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is actually the largest of 5 such zones where the confluence of oceanic currents traps large masses of floating trash. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reports that most of the debris that comprises these patches is, quote, small bits of plastic or microplastics smaller than 5 millimeters in size that are suspended throughout the water column. The smaller scale makes these microplastics no less hazardous to ocean life, but it does mean that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is not visible from space. In places, it is hardly visible to the naked eye, as this image taken during a 2016 research expedition makes abundantly clear. In his 2011 memoir, Moore insists that, quote, what we came upon was not a mountain of trash, an island of trash, a raft of trash, or a swirling vortex of trash. And he dismisses the stories and images of vast expanses of floating plastic as, quote, media-concocted embellishments of the truth. His account of that first trip to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch bemoans the sight of plastic as far as the eye could see, meaning he never found himself out of sight of some floating debris. But the ambiguous wording made it easy to imagine an unbroken sea of trash. This suggestive ambiguity was not unique to Moore's account. In 2006, Kenneth Weiss and Usha Lee McFarling won a Pulitzer Prize for their series in the Los Angeles Times that compared this, quote, slowly rotating mass of trash-laden water, about twice the size of Texas, to foam piling up in the calm center of a hot tub. Later in the same article, they acknowledged that the debris circulating in these garbage patches is, quote, often diffuse and hard to see, bobbing just below the surface, but this catches the imagination less forcefully than the image of the world's largest dump vomiting discarded plastic onto the beaches of various Pacific islands. A popular myth persists of a great island of trash floating between the Golden and Aloha states. Even today, a Google image search returns results that portray the accumulation of ocean-bound plastics in geographic terms, using bird's-eye view photographs and stylized maps to depict the garbage patch as a new landmass. Joe Harris and Martine Morazzo's 18-issue comic series Great Pacific even goes as far as to imagine a new nation-state rising up on this man-made island. Chaz Worthington, oil heir and founding father of this scrappy nation, christens his territory New Texas, which the text treats as a reference to the popular trend of measuring the size of the garbage patch in multiples of the Lone Star State, as well as a provocation for the excesses of consumption that simultaneously make everything bigger in Texas and fill the oceans with plastic. This idea and these images are horrifying, but they represent the problem of plastic as something immediately visible and obviously threatening. The NOAA describes them as, quote, more like flecks of pepper floating throughout a bowl of soup, a food metaphor that, curiously, appears frequently in contemporary descriptions of the phenomenon. Moore himself calls the garbage patch a soup lightly seasoned with plastic flakes, bulked out here and there with dumplings, buoys, net clumps, floats, crates, and other macro debris. The sociologist Manus Lebrun attributes this descriptive progression from island to soup and beyond to the representative challenges of rendering the materiality, scale, agency, and locus for effective action of marine plastics as clear as possible. One reason that this proves to be such a challenge is that we have been conditioned to prefer dumplings to broth and spectacles to slow decay. This is the distinction Rob Nixon articulates in his Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, where he develops a methodology for meeting the representational, narrative, and strategic challenges posed by the relative invisibility of slow violence. Nixon invites us to focus on those types of ecological disaster that occur gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch provides an especially clear example of this last characteristic of slow violence. As public awareness of the gyre has shifted from the spectacle of a Texas-sized garbage island to a nearly invisible particulate mass, the danger it represents gets less and less imminent. Now that it can't be seen, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch hardly seems to pose a threat at all. The failed representation of disasters can be a disaster itself, as this 2011 editorial in a plastics industry trade publication makes clear. Mark Steven, editor of Canadian Plastics, breathlessly cites a study by Oregon State oceanographer Angelique White and a subsequent story in McLean's magazine that conclude that the patch is less solid and less visible than previously reported. Steven seizes upon White's tepid conclusion that the garbage patch doesn't seem to be as bad as advertised with, quote, positive delight, celebrating this as the fatal leak that will, he hopes, send one of the biggest anti-plastic stories of recent years down to a watery grave. Steven's editorial shows how readily the reduced visibility of slow violence can be made to obscure the presence of danger, and the ease with which this gap between threat and spectacle can be widened to swallow up questions of environmental responsibility and agency. The stories we tell about ecological crises affect the responses they receive. The mass of marine plastics must be something we stand against, even if it is no longer something we can stand on. As this panel invites us to imagine replacing climate studies, I want to consider new ways to teach the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, replacing, or at least complicating, the flawed narrative of a geographical spectacle of trash. With Amitav Ghosh, we must recognize that the problems we are facing now are simply too improbable to be represented by a single narrative or voice, and so one way to capture slow violence is in the accumulation of perspectives on the same disaster. We can, in other words, learn to savor broth by taking dumplings and the Hollywood disaster off the menu and focusing on the thinking that happens between texts rather than solely within them. With this in mind, I've compiled a textual archipelago of sorts, works that address the Great Pacific Garbage Patch across its range of media and genre, so the narrative of the gyre is as diffuse as the plastics that pepper its waters. One of the benefits of an approach like this is that it makes more room for allegory and subtlety, as each text that enters into a conversation framed this way is responsible only for speaking toward an understanding, rather than encapsulating it totally. This can be incredibly recuperative for something like Harrison Marazzo's Great Pacific, which would otherwise be crippled by its trash island setting. I maintain, however, that Harrison Marazzo's reliance on utopian technologies, over-the-top characters, nuclear mutations, and Deus Ex Machina resolutions are more legible as an illustration of the inherently absurd narratives that would have to be set in such an impossible place. Harris's plots are transparently spectacular, and Marazzo's art revels in the type of bland Hollywood violence that so often obscures the slow burn of ecological devastation. It would be eminently difficult to mistake the island nation of New Texas for any real physical location, which makes the quiet moments where Harris and Marazzo reflect on the messy entanglement of political action and profit motive all the more startling. Great Pacific is most interesting for the portions of its plot that take place away from the island of trash. In New Texas, Chaz Worthington succeeds in spite of himself, often enough to stretch the reader's credulity. But in the boardroom, his savvy recognition that a problem of this scale is a responsibility shared by Wall Street and the White House grounds this text more than the recurring appearance of octopus monsters first suggests. This willingness to look away from the garbage patch is shared by many of the texts that I point to here, which suggests that one of the benefits this polyvocal approach offers is the displacement of the narrative of unsightly visibility I critiqued earlier. We can then think about replacing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch so that it becomes omnipresent, lurking ominously even at a far remove from its ocean home. This is the central claim being made in James Ferraro's 2011 album Farside Virtual, which I've been using as the background music for this talk. Created by sampling, among other things, MIDI sound files and computer system tones, Farside Virtual condemns the vapid noise that serves as the ambient soundtrack for a culture that produces without purpose and lingers with no sense of legacy. Ferraro identifies consumer transience as the source material and has even called the album a, quote, rubbery plastic symphony for global warming, dedicated to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Naming the garbage patch as his inspiration allows Ferraro to eliminate the comforting distance between ends of the trash life cycle. Farside Virtual infects the soundscape of modern life with traces of the refuse that it produces. Calling this ringtone music and imagining it piping through smartphones allows Ferraro to pull the garbage patch out of the Pacific and make it in every place, so that the deleterious effects of a culture of excess remain continuous with the patterns of consumption that produce it. As these perspectives on the garbage patch multiply and circulate, I should note that they are still bogged down in the geographical. Great Pacific replaces New Texas as a site of fantasy, but a site nonetheless, while Farside Virtual maps a gyre whose boundaries are infinitely inclusive. The textless images in Rachel Hope Allison's graphic novel, I'm Not a Plastic Bag, imagine the garbage patch not as a landmass, but as a life form, and one whose grinning face belies the sinister effects of its actions. The eye of Allison's title grows quickly as ocean currents pack ever more trash onto its body, and its swelling size brings it into increasing contact with the animal life of its ocean habitat. Allison's smiling garbage patch shows an endless curiosity to match its hunger, seeking out seabirds and grasping for squids. Thinking of the garbage patch as a predator rather than a poisoned landscape proves surprisingly effective for reflecting intimately on the deadly effect this flotsam can have on the wildlife that enter its orbit. There are some ways that Allison's depiction of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch as a man-made megafauna should give us pause, especially given her reliance on megaplastics to visualize the predator. However, by the end of I'm Not a Plastic Bag, the patch dissolves into a spectral presence that haunts the Pacific, so that Allison's contemplation of its effects cannot be conflated with a certain appearance. Nevertheless, the genial expressions that Allison manages to evoke with a well-placed tire and umbrella ensure that we can never quite equate these actions with malice. The garbage patch is a beast with deadly claws but limited agency, and Allison insists on tracing its origins back to careless human actions. The printed version of her graphic novel, with its thick recycled cardboard cover, serves as a powerful paratextual complement to the argument here. As an object, I'm Not a Plastic Bag is visually and tactily marked as a disruption of the material practices that birth the creature the text narrates. Perhaps this is the clearest way to think about the text of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. They recognize the gyre as a powerful new paratext that disrupts traditional reading patterns. Ruth Ozeki manages this relation masterfully in her 2013 novel A Tale for the Time Being, in which a lunchbox watches ashore in British Columbia following the devastating Japanese tsunami of a few years earlier. In it, a fictionalized version of Ruth Ozeki finds the secret diary of a Japanese schoolgirl named Naoko Yasutani, and the story that unfolds alternates between Nao's first-person writing and Ruth's investigation of her life in the third person. The Pacific Gyre is a powerful, if peripheral, force within the text. The narrative is driven by the ocean currents that bear the lunchbox and other trash from one side of the Pacific to the other, and much of the novel's philosophical depth comes in Ozeki's reflections on quantum entanglement between her and Nao's life that are only made manifest through the garbage patch that connects their stories. A Tale for the Time Being can be described as Ozeki's experimentation with the quantum principles of superposition, by which a particle can be in two or more places or states at once, and entanglement, by which two particles can coordinate their properties across space and time and behave like a single system, as narrative functions. Part of the genius of the novel is that she recognizes how the questions of scale and material interconnection that are wrapped up in the problem of ocean pollution present an opportunity to transpose these concepts from the submicroscopic to larger scales. As Ruth finds more and more of herself in the diary she reads, the gyre becomes the medium through which these interrelations between her and Nao unfold. It is, in this way, much like the box containing Schrodinger's cat and a vial of poison in the famous thought experiment, which Ozeki returns to several times in the text, as a way to reflect on how her life and Nao's become wrapped up together. The quantum entanglement of lives within the text makes it very difficult to fully assess the causality of the narrative, which ought to be an important way of addressing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It lays bare the conditions by which material connections mutually compose actors widely dispersed in time and space. In other words, Ozeki rightly intuits the utility of the patch for thinking about patterns of consumption and connection that tie individual actions on opposite sides of the globe together. Thus, though it would seem that the discovery of Nao's journal precipitates Ruth's narrative in response, Ruth's actions also wield a powerful influence over Nao's life, despite the gulf in time and space that separates them. As Nao's entries become increasingly desperate and forlorn following several personal traumas that she endures, Ruth becomes frantic with the need to intervene somehow, and finds her own life unraveling as a result. Finally, in a dream, she plunges into the debris-filled waters of the Pacific and recovers a long-lost Yasutani family document, which she is then able to leave for Nao to find in the past. This moment of the text is startling because it is impossible, or ought to be, But that, again, is what the work of representing the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is meant to do. It shows how properly understanding and living with a phenomenon of this scale means recognizing the impact that previously unthinkable actions have on the most intimate levels. This presentation has attempted to multiply the ways this impossible scale can be measured as a corrective to the flawed island of trash narrative that too easily descends into a gotcha moment for the plastics industry. In Great Pacific, the gyre is rewritten as a set of fantasy. Farside Virtual sees it instead as a boundaryless every place of post-culture culture. I'm Not a Plastic Bag imagines a new spectral predator haunting the seas, and A Tale for the Time Being makes these ocean currents a quantum wave function, containing the possibility of life and death simultaneously. I want to close with a final, fifth representation of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that returns to the world of scientific measurement. As Laura Parker reported in October 2018, quote, "The inevitable has happened. Microplastics have long been found inside birds and fish, but they have finally reached such a saturation point in the water we drink and food we eat that they have now been detected in human stool samples." The ecologist Chelsea Rockman calls these findings not surprising and adds that, quote, "We are eating our waste. Mismanagement has come back to us on our dinner plates." The food-based description of the plastic problem as a well-seasoned soup has proven prescient, and as a result the gyre is less a distant blight than a now embodied aspect of human life. We are the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and that is a story much harder to discard.